Stephanie.
And I'm Summer.
And you're listening to Broke and Broken.
Because we're both.
The podcast about living your best life by getting real.
Hey, broken people. Today we're going to do something a little different. Stephanie is going to interview me.
Yes. So, hello, broken people.
So
this is Stephanie, and I'm going to be interviewing Summer today. Tell us how this came about.
How this idea happened. Okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, we've been working on the podcast. We started this idea many months before it actually aired. At first, we were waiting on Stephanie to get geographically closer, and then it became clear that wasn't happening anytime soon, so we just kind of went with it. But we had recorded, I guess, 3 or 4 episodes, and we're getting feedback and questions from people. And then the other day, I had a friend was over, and of course, relatively recent friends. We only met like a year ago, started hanging out about 6 months ago. So he doesn't really know a whole lot about me. And he was in my house. Okay, I tell a little bits and pieces about myself in the interviews, which is why there's a lot of questions from people, because I don't elaborate and it creates a lot of weird questions. So I have 4 college degrees, okay? I have a bachelor, 2 masters, and a law degree. I don't tell a lot of people this. There are people who have known me for years who don't know this. And I don't have an office right now. The law work I do, I'm mobile. So I don't have an office to hang my diplomas in.
Yes.
And last time I left them not hanging up, a dog ate them and I had to reframe them, and I don't really want them. That literally happened. It was a bulldog and I loved him, but he was stupid.
Yeah, the dog didn't eat the homework. He chewed up the diploma.
And the frame, and yeah, it was horrible. Fortunately, I had it in a big matted frame, so he didn't actually destroy the diploma. He had just the frame of the mat before I found it. So they're hanging on the wall in my bedroom because almost nobody's ever here. I don't let people come over, and so nobody ever sees it. So I forget they're there. They're just like hanging on the wall. So
and they're hanging on her wall so that they don't get misplaced.
Right.
I remember how carefully, over the course of the most recent move.
Oh, right. You helped me move.
So we were both keeping track of where that box was, because there's some things you just don't want to lose.
They're so expensive.
And the reality is, we have children, and you lead the kind of busy lives that we both do. We both have big families. If you hang it on the wall, you're more likely to find it when
it doesn't get destroyed. It doesn't get destroyed. So
exactly.
when he got up to leave, I saw he kept staring at the wall, and I'm just like not saying anything. I'm just watching him. He doesn't know I'm watching him. And finally, he just kind of blurts out, and I don't know if he meant to say it out loud or not. He says, "Damn, who are you?" And I sat there for it probably took me about 30 seconds to answer, because I have all these thoughts going through my head, and I think what I finally said was, "Nobody." And he's like, clearly that's not true. But in my head, I'm just like, you know what? I really don't fucking know, to be honest. So all these things have come up in the course of these interviews of the podcast. I've talked about growing up a preacher's kid, and I've talked about all this stuff. And, I've been married, I've been divorced, I've got a bazillion children. I've got a little small tribe that I keep here. So the reality isn't very complicated, and it is very confusing, and I've had questions from listeners like, I don't understand, what's going on. So I'm going to let Stephanie interview me to kind of answer some of those questions, because I do talk about being a rape survivor and all of that, and she knows all these things, so she can kind of lead me through this. And then at some point I do want to talk about the episode about being a PK and families and how wonderful that is. But I'll let Stephanie kind of lead from here.
Yes. So we all have a history, and how we get from, where we were, growing up, our experiences affect who we become as adults. Sometimes there's things that we need to overcome, and sometimes they are as well the resilience that we have or do not have, and sometimes it's both. So tell us a little bit about your childhood home and the dynamic, how you grew up.
Okay, so I call myself a recovering PK, which for people who didn't grow up evangelical, PK is the abbreviation for preacher's kid. And there's always this stereotype about the preacher's kid being wild and crazy, and it is true for some of us. But I think a lot of that comes from the pushback against the repression that happens, because there is this idea, and it's taught very openly, and particularly in evangelical, and especially the more extreme ends you get to that if a if a minister cannot control his own household, then, and I say his because in a lot of those churches women are still not allowed to be ministers, but that's a whole other issue. That has shifted up somewhat, but it's still very prevalent. But that if a minister can't control, and yes, that is the word they use, their own household, then they are not fit to lead a church. And so that means that the children are expected to not make natural normal mistakes. You're expected to always put on appearances. The family's supposed to appear perfect, and and so you create this facade, just kind of naturally ends up being created. And there's a lot that in a lot of our homes ends up not being dealt with, not being handled properly. And there's a lot of shame because you get there is a certain amount of shame that happens in the churches, in these, especially
and
like I said.
And to push things under the rug because appearances matter more.
Right. There's a certain amount.
Reality. Right. And that is so harmful because whenever we cover up struggles, we also are covering up the ability and the resiliency that comes with recovering and support.
Right.
This is why I am a big supporter of transparency. And shoving something under the rug is never going to make it go away. In fact, it just perpetuates cycles
it
of
makes
what
it
is
worse.
oftentimes abuse.
Right.
It makes it worse.
So there's a certain amount of shame that already happens in the church, and then that's magnified exponentially in ministers' homes, even when they're not meaning to or they're trying to not, because you have to have that facade and you have to have it all together, or the people in the church and the community won't trust the minister. And so it gets to be this complicated problem that a lot of times you don't even see while you're in it. And so compound on top of that, my father, so I was a preacher's kid, so that carries its own little interesting dynamic. And then as well, there's some other issues, of course, we're from a Native community, there's the whole intergenerational trauma that happens, because the boarding schools and all of this, the boarding schools introduced abuse and substance abuse as well into our communities. I mean, it is a very bright line that you can see in our community in particular of where that happened. And so there's some abuse history in the family dynamic. Now, my parents tried to be very deliberate to not propagate that same abuse to us. However, when you grow up with a certain level of abuse, your concept of what constitutes abuse is a bit skewed. So what they thought was not abusive would be considered abusive by a lot of people. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And
so
things
that
change
scales
from one generation to the next.
No, even in that generation, it's considered abuse by most people. It's just it was less than what Dad got, so he in his mind it was better, right? So like I get it, like he still wasn't okay. There was a lot of it that still wasn't okay, but I understand like where he's coming from. Like his intent wasn't to be abusive. He thought, well, if I keep it within these parameters, it's okay, even though it's not really, and it's still harmful. But also, my dad my mother was a child bride. She was married off to him after she turned 17. And when I say after, like, they got married on June 18th, and she had just turned 17 on May 25th. So a few weeks after her 17th birthday, they got married. He was a full 7 years older than her. Years later, because I find myself deliberately pushing their comfort zone a lot and talking about things they don't want to talk about, but it has made
because that's what summer does.
That's what summer does. But you know what? It has brought a lot of healing and reconciliation into our family, and they are completely different people than the people who raised me, and that's the only reason I trust them with my children. And
I've had that same dynamic and experience with my own family. We can be a catalyst to bring about change, and we need to not fear being the driving person that puts people in a position of needing to examine their lives and their decisions, and not just, so often we just do what our parents did who did what their parents did. No.
Right.
We need to think about what healthy we need to think about what healthy is and does, and what will lead to success, and then we need to intentionally begin to make our choices. One of my pet peeves, I say that people choose partners with less consideration than they do their next puppy or their next car. So we need to be intentional and deliberate in how we're living. And,
well, that's because we've been sold the lie of romance instead of reality.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
where you're just supposed to get swept up and be in love and marry that person and be together
no,
forever, and that's
dangerous.
not right.
Yeah.
It's not reality. But he will admit now, or he has. I haven't talked to him about this in a few years, but at one point he did finally acknowledge that part of the reason he chose a child was because she was easier to control and manipulate, because that's the person he was at that time. That's where he was. And so that's why, you know, anybody who follows me on social media knows that I'm very anti-child marriage, and I'm an advocate for
it's abuse.
Right. On top of that, also my father has been disabled since he was 15. He was in a car accident when he was 15. He's died multiple times. We have no idea why he's still alive. Nobody can explain it. It just is. So and he's doing relatively a lot better in my adult, in his health during my adult life. But when we were children, especially very small children, he was in the hospital dying, and I mean literally dying and having to be resuscitated.
Yes.
At least once or twice a year. So we spend a lot of time with family members, with aunties, with grandparents. So there's always this stress of, is he going to die? I didn't grow up with this privilege or luxury of believing that anything is permanent. That's why I always tell people, and they think I'm talking about divorce, but I always tell people all relationships are temporary. And I'm not actually talking about divorce necessarily, although that does happen and that's perfectly valid. I'm also very well aware that we're mortal and we don't always have control over that.
Right. Well, and if you look at the longevity that we have in our community, I mean, it's a logical conclusion,
right,
to come to, and a populace that has the highest rates of death and fatality of any group or race of people in the United States.
Yes.
As indigenous people. So we're faced with this on a daily basis.
Right.
Either we ourselves or somebody close to us is dealing with death and multiple deaths.
Yes.
Every single week.
I cannot relate to these people who are grown-ass people who say they have never lost anybody close to them. Like, I do not understand this. I remember my first funeral at 3. We lose people all the fucking time. Like, I don't understand how you can get to. Do you not have family? Like, how does this happen that you can get to be grown?
The thing is they only have their nuclear family, and they are not relying on, and they're not building and maintaining those relationships with their extended family.
That's bizarre to me.
That is part of
but even friends,
the colonial mindset.
They don't even lose friends though, because I've been losing friends since I was a kid too. Like, I don't understand.
Well, think about it. How many white friends have you lost since you were a child?
I haven't had that many white friends.
But how many white people did you know or grow up with?
A couple.
Yes.
And I think they died during high school. Yeah.
To the monumental and the essentially avalanche of losses that we face as indigenous people.
That's true. A lot more.
I have only lost, if I really think about it, now I have one cousin who committed suicide when I was growing up. I've lost, my grandparents' generation and the aunts and uncles, and I'm talking about the white part of my family. And then I lost a near and dear to my heart friend at the age of 46 who had a heart attack.
Right.
So, compare those two losses to the other side of my family, and it's absolutely surreal. So this is what we talk about when we're discussing intergenerational trauma. Right. This is something that most people cannot really relate to.
So because of his health problems, he had a very short temper, very low tolerance for children. I mean, honestly, when they decided to have children, he didn't expect to be around for very long, so I don't think he really thought about what it was going to be like to raise children. And
now he's helping raise grandchildren,
right?
So who would have thought?
But he was very short-tempered, and we didn't really learn so much of what to what to do and not to do. We learned don't piss dad off. That was the
yes.
In any event,
so describe your
Go ahead.
Your family. So who did you grow up with in the home? And I know you had extended family, but
actually in
your home.
Actually, in the house, my parents, my mom and my dad, and their other daughter, who is 21 months older than me.
Yes.
So, and I actually asked her to do an episode of the podcast because I have gotten a lot of questions about what it's like to be a PK, because which I don't think any of it's made into the episodes because it was kind of a tangential thing, but most of the interviews I've done where that was brought up, that they wanted to know more, what's that like? And so I wanted to do an episode with her on what it's like to be a PK, and her initial response was, I don't know that I can do that because I still have a lot of unresolved trauma that I don't really like talking about, which was fine. Like, if you haven't processed that,
that's where she's at.
That's perfectly fine. I don't want to push you to do that. So then a few days ago, I get a, but she did ask for the links to listen to the podcasts that are up, and so she could consider that, right? So I gave them to her, and telling her I've not told our family about this because I don't want to have conversations with them about this stuff. In fact, when I used to have a blog, it had a disclaimer on there that said, if I know you in real life, don't read past here. And when you do, sorry, a timer on my phone, because I'm cooking too, because I'm hungry. And when you do, if I haven't talked to you about these issues, and don't bring them up to me because I don't want to talk to you about them. So I told her that, and I hope she's going to keep that. I mean, to be honest, she and I don't have a relationship. It's non-existent. I'm sure everybody noticed I call her my parents' other daughter, not my sister. We can go into why that happened in a few minutes.
We should.
But
so when did that?
Well, let's finish what happened with the podcast, and then we can go there. So a few days ago, she sends me a text, says, I listened to your podcast and I have a few questions to better understand some things. So I think she's still considering coming on and, trying to figure this out, right? So then she says, you refer to anxiety beginning when you were young and PTSD starting at 14. What do you consider to be the cause of these things? And so I tell her, I'm like, that's really not something I'm going to talk to you about. It's from an incident, as the PTSD is not related to anybody in the home, and it's not something I want to discuss with you. It has nothing to do with the episode that that I'm trying to do with you. And so then she's still pushing that boundary. I'm trying to understand where you're coming from and how this would connect with the subject of growing up as a PK. And I'm like, it doesn't. That's why I'm not going to discuss it with you. So then and I reminded her again, I don't want to discuss these things with the family. If I felt it was safe to discuss the stuff with the family, I would have told them in 1995 when it happened. I don't want to have this conversation. So then I get a long 3-paragraph text message that says, I do tend to not talk to family members because I live my life differently, but I still have very conservative views, which, as we all know, is just coded language for I'm a bigot, but that's another issue. As does my husband. I do tend to parent somewhat different, but I'm not against some methods used while we were raised, just not to the extent they were used with us, which I assume to mean she hits her kids. She's very critical of me. She doesn't think I hit my kids enough.
You didn't drink enough of that child beating Kool-Aid, did you?
Right. I have never uttered the words, keep on crying and I'll give you something to cry about.
Yes. No, I don't. No, let's stop right there. Let's look at that. This is why we have entire segments of society, because they are perpetuating this broken history from one generation to the next.
Listen to the next 2 paragraphs so you can get the full feel on that one. I believe that a child should be respectful to all adults and address them with yes ma'am and yes sir, etc. They should have responsibilities and work for things. My children do all of those. The irony is all of her children are younger than most of my children, which is cute. In a nutshell, this is my house and these are my rules. My children will be respectful, productive citizens when they leave my house, which I assume she thinks you have to hit them to make that happen. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying spanking your children is, absolute horrible or whatever, but it's not necessary. It's not the only way to get there.
Well, now oh boy, respect all adults. I think that's a load of horse shit, because all adults are not respectful. And
I think that, and I do find that, I do believe that yes ma'am, no ma'am comment was directly related to my children do not call her that. But that dates back to when my first son was born. In our way, we're matrilineal. She would be called mom. She would be called their mother as well. She told my oldest son that he was not allowed to call her that.
Yes. And
she left the family. She left our community. you don't automatically get that. That's not how it works.
And that is a really, I want to know, and we've talked about this before, and I discussed this actually with my daughters. I said that one of your sons had called, his aunt by that traditional name, which is the other mother, to see my daughter's faces. I wish you could have been a fly on the wall, because they were utterly scandalized, as I was when you shared that with me. I'm wondering, is that when she became your parents' other daughter versus your sister, or was it before that time?
No, it was actually after that time. I still tried to maintain a relationship with her, and I did for many years. I mean, of course, he's 17 now, and this happened when he was a toddler. Well, he was an early...
Because she declined, in a pretty harmful way.
Right.
To accept the responsibilities, the family responsibilities at that point. That was a clear line drawn in the sand. So I'm stunned that you continued from that point forward, because that's just so, it hurts my spirit.
I recognize that a lot of it is her trauma, and I do recognize that her choice to leave the community and become Naholo, as we say, is in large part due to that, and of course her worldview and her values as well. But I did continue to try to keep a relationship. We talked a lot. I tried to encourage her to get therapy before she had children. I don't know if she did or she didn't. I have no idea. I'm not gonna speculate.
You don't have that sort of relationship where you can ask those kinds of things.
Right. I'm not going to speculate on that.
I want to say something. Real quick.
Go ahead.
She said, "My house, my rules."
Yes.
And
which is that very controlling.
Yes, for our listeners, it is my sincere hope and prayer that the home that your children are raised in is not just your home, but it is their home as well. I think we need to all take a step back and have the mentality of the home that people live in, whether it includes grandparents and parents or parents and children. It needs to be a collective home, not my house, my rules, my way, and screw you. But they need to have a home as well. And that type of thinking is not productive or conducive to healthy relationships and healthy boundaries between children and parents.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I think that is one thing that we grew up with. They're very much in control, and this is their home, and you're allowed to live in it, and you're allowed to breathe. I do use that phrase a lot. This is my house and my rules, but I think my kids know, and I've been very explicit to them, and I know a lot of Naholo people criticize me openly about this, because they come, they say it to me, that I have always told my children, you can question the rules, you can question, why things have to be this way, but you're going to do it with words and respect. And timing is important, Sometimes I'm going to tell you, now's not the time, just do it, and then we'll talk about it. But I believe that's important. I believe that's important. They need to learn that logical thought processing. I don't believe in blind obedience to any authority.
Yes.
I believe...
And it should be up for discussion.
Right.
This is, there are times when I give a hard rule, and my teenagers bump up against the rule. They want to have their electronics 24/7, and I don't see that the dependence that they have on them as being healthy to their mental, emotional, or spiritual development. So, my 17-year-old is button hard, and I've told her, I said, when you're 21, you can have it all the time.
Right.
But she's welcome to move out before she's 21 too. But,
right.
While she's getting an education and knowing that their friends and cousins, etc., seeing the results of their lack of sleep and how it is affecting them educationally. There are times now that they're getting older that they have actually come to me and said, thank you for doing this. Right. So that is the hard part of parenting. But all rules in my home are open to discussion, but I set them.
Right.
And I think they can live with them or not, and they need to respectfully come to me and not, from a point of being pissed off or angry and door slamming. But if they want to come to me respectfully, and we have annual meetings in our home, by the way. Yes, we do. We sit down and we discuss everything front to back about twice a year. We discuss their education, we discuss their goals, we discuss where they're going and what they need to do to get there, and how I can help them to meet those goals. And I also want to acknowledge the growth that they've had over the last 6 months to a year, and where we're going to go from there on forward. So if you can't have dialogue with your children like that, and I think all parents need to, then those parents have some work that they need to do in order to bring up healthy children who can contribute rather than simply take from society.
Right, and that's why I do it. I feel like it's important to the decision making, to the learning. They have to learn to take care of themselves. They have to learn how to make their own decisions. And that's one thing about being in such a controlled environment, like growing up as a PK. A lot of times you get a list of rules and you have to do them, and you don't understand why you have to do them, and so you don't learn those skills. And that's one thing that I saw with her, and I actually confronted my parents about that at one point when we were living together my freshman year of college. She didn't know how to take care of herself. She didn't know how to make these, I mean, she could clean a house, she could cook for herself, but making sound decisions, she didn't know how to do that. She had never been, because she was the compliant child. I was the child who's going to do whatever the fuck I want, and you can beat me to death for it, but that's fine. I still won because I still did what I wanted.
Yes.
And so that personality difference made a big difference developmentally, because she went into, you know, she graduated and went to college not really having any experience in making sound, you know, those sound decisions or anything like that. And so I confronted my parents about that at one point, because they were trying to ground her from, you know, from a distance, and they wanted me to like supervise this. I'm like, no, she's grown. Like at this point, she's like,
and you are younger than her, and
right?
This is putting you in a really awkward position.
Yeah, I'm not going to be your narc.
Even if you were younger than her, you know, that's just.
Right.
Yeah, that's just unhealthy and unacceptable to put you.
Right.
You know, that's playing one child against the other.
Well, and that's part of why we don't have a sound relationship, because that was the setup the whole time we were growing up. There was always this this conflict that was created by them. I don't think it was intentional, obviously, but especially when you're in a household where sometimes it can be explosive and sometimes it can be physically violent. I hate to use that word because it's such a broad word, but I mean sometimes, I mean when you're getting hit with a fucking leather whip, I don't know what the hell else you call it.
Yeah, yes. Well, and you know, and in 2018, people don't be hitting your children with belts. That's child abuse.
I was hit with a riding crawl for a horse. You know, one of those it's got the two leather straps on it, and I was they had me showing sheep because, you know, country. For 1 year, and there's certain ways you're supposed to move and certain ways you're supposed to stand and everything, and I moved my foot, and so I got hit, and I mean, like, it was, I lost count at 7. I don't know how many times he hit my leg.
Okay, and let me stop right quick. She doesn't know how many times he hit her leg because she checked out.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, anytime we got Dad would call it whooping. We got whoopings with a belt, a leather belt.
Yes.
It was creased in half. It was creased in half, and it was always, how I got through it was, even from the time I was little bitty, he didn't believe, you know, you weren't allowed to move. Like, this whole run-in business, no way. That did not happen in our house. You had to lay over the bed so that you were still, and he would hit you on the butt. I'm doing air quotes here for people who can't see me, which usually translates to somewhere between the middle of your back to the back of your knees, because you're not that fucking accurate, you know, on a tiny child. You're just not. And so how I would get through it was I would count how many times it hit me. I always lost count at 10. It was never less than that. I always lost count at 10. And so that was just, you know, his quote discipline. And I say the quote because that is not what that fucking word means.
That's not what discipline means.
Exactly.
And,
that's not what it means.
If you want to discipline your children, folks, please sit down and talk to and educate your children and give them healthy boundaries and consequences for their actions, but please don't beat your children.
Right.
We don't support beating children at Broken. So
that's why we're broken.
Maybe we need to, and you know, no, we definitely need to have a talk and about what child discipline and healthy child discipline looks like, and how to recover from inappropriate discipline. I'm
working on getting someone who works with children and child development to come on at some point. So we did try to keep a relationship with her, because I realized a lot of the stuff is her trauma. It's not her fault. She didn't ask for this. So I tried to, you know, keep, even though sometimes, man, it was really hard. Cause like when she told my son, you can't call me that. Or when after I had 2 boys, you
can't call me other mom. That's just heartbreaking. I can't stop there.
I know. Stephanie is traumatized by proxy.
I am traumatized by this. I really am traumatized by this. It makes me cry.
So
it really does. It makes me weep for your children.
So when they were both toddlers, they because they're like 21 months apart too. They're very close together.
Yes.
They, which happened by accident, but because the younger one was born early. But
see, mine are really close together like that intentionally.
No, this was Summer's bad planning. Summer can't plan, okay? When she's ovulating, her brain doesn't work. And
no, yeah, I can admit to that one. But no, I wanted to have kids crazy close together because of my family of origin. We were all 7 years apart.
Oh, dang, so that's a big
I was like, fuck that. We don't need to do that. So it was like raising different, essentially, literally raising different generations in one home because we don't even belong to the same.
Yeah. So when my boys were toddlers, I had a class that I did out at in Albuquerque, and at that time, because she married a white dude that works in oil field, so they move every few years, because I guess that's just how it works. In order to get promotions, you end up having to move to a new location.
Yeah.
So at this time, they were out in Farmington. While we were out, we were already out in Albuquerque, so I'm like, okay, let's run over to Farmington and we'll visit. So we went out there, and she's very American, with status and neighborhood and what have you. And apparently they belong to a country club. Now, first of all, I don't know what the fuck to do at a country club. I've never been to one. I don't know. So she wants to take me to the country club because she's trying to show it off to me, and I'm just like, okay, whatever, I'll go, sure. But then she tells me, because she is we talk about me being ethnically ambiguous. Most people don't know what I am. She's completely white passing. She's very light. She has blonde hair. At some point it got darker. I don't know if she lightens it or if it just got light again, but she's blonde. So she tells me not to say anything about being Choctaw because the people there don't know that she's Native. And I'm sitting here.
So she doesn't, the people. So she's living in a community as a white passing indigenous person who grew up within her own community. So
right. So at this point, this is when I realized, oh no, she has deliberately and completely left our community. Like, she does not see a connection to us. And so I'm looking at myself now. I was much darker than I'd been spending time in the sun. I'm a vampire now that never gets sunlight. That, and I use a lot of sunscreen because I'm not trying to look old. I gotta choose my vanities and wrinkles. So I'm looking at myself, and I look at my two little long-haired boys, and I'm like, and who were darker than me. Their dad is Cherokee. So, and I asked her, I said, how, if your friends don't know, how are you going to explain us? I'm like, you can't take these little Indian boys in there and introduce them as your nephews and somebody not ask a fucking question. How? I'm like,
how did you? She didn't work that out. She was. No. This is what we call. This is what we call cognitive dissonance.
Fair.
This is what we call cognitive dissonance. Okay, go ahead.
So she hadn't thought about that, and I'm like, and so she's getting kind of flustered. I'm like, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, like, you're trying to take me to the country club. I'm not really impressed by that. I don't understand what, now you're telling me I can't be me and I have to hide who me and my boys are, and I don't know what you want me to do. Like, I can hang out back with Jose the gardener and have a much better time than sitting in your fucking country club doing whatever the hell it is you're doing there. Like, I don't know. So in any event, we ended up going to like museums and historical sites instead of going to country club because there was no way to explain it really and not out herself. So after that, I'm like, okay, but I still talked to her some, and we still talked about some things, but things would get more and more extreme. Like, at one point during one of their moves, I think it was one of the times they moved to Pennsylvania, and she was telling me about shopping for houses, which I can't relate to. Like, I don't understand, I want to live in a gated community and blah blah blah. So this perspective is very different. And she tells me at one point, I'm like, okay, what are you looking for? Because I was trying to like help her look online or whatever for listings and what have you, and we're talking about stuff, and I ask her what she's looking for, and she tells me that she literally, when she looks at these listings, she looks up the demographics of the neighborhood to see how many minorities live there, and she wants the lowest number possible. And I'm like, you are fucking racist. And she got so mad at me. And
that is racism.
Yes.
That is racism. And I want you guys to know I do the flip-flop when I look at a community, because I can't have my brown kids growing up in a community that's 95% Navajo.
Right? Like, I literally
I can't have them in a community of 95% white people because it's not safe for.
You're right.
I've got a few white passing kids, but far and away, my sons are pretty dark, and
Right.
that's really dangerous, because I don't want, this problem that we have going on right now with people calling the police on people for living and walking while brown. I don't want that to be inflicted upon my children, because I don't want them to die.
Right.
I don't want them to be arrested, and I don't want them to be assaulted. So this is why I look at the demographics of a community, because bigots are drawn to neighborhoods, which I'm sorry, but I'm sorry to use that word, but that is a tactic that is used. It was used 100 years ago, and it's used in different ways in 2018.
Right. And I mean, I moved accidentally into a neighborhood one time that was very bigoted, and ended up with my daughter having the police called on her repeatedly just for walking home from school, because she was the only brown kid walking by this lady's house. And
yes.
I mean, I had looked at the school, I knew
trauma.
The school.
We were scandalized, and we were horrified.
I had to move.
Did.
Because I didn't know,
yes.
I knew the school was diverse. I didn't know there was an imaginary line there that I moved on the wrong side of by about 3 houses. So after that, we kind of distanced more and more, especially because I would call her out on these things, and she got to be more and more closed-minded and more that direction, as she calls it, conservative views, which, like I said, we all know is coded language, because it doesn't actually mean what the word conservative means. So in any event, when I started calling her my parents' other daughter, that happened. That didn't happen until last year. Last year, my grandfather went into the hospital, somewhere during February, I think it was.
I remember when that happened.
Right,
yeah.
And I was spending. I was going out almost every weekend to Tulsa, where he was hospitalized, which is about 2 hours from here. I was making the trip out there, and which is kind of complicated when you have a house full of children. But I was going out there, and she at the time, I think, was in Pennsylvania, and so she wanted to Skype with him, so I let her, so I figured out how to connect with her on Skype and let him Skype or whatever. And she kept making excuses, like, I can't come because they've got this, her kids were both preschool, I think, neither one were in an actual real school. They can't miss school, they can't. Okay, fine, if you can't come, whatever, you don't have to come, it's fine.
They can't
I know.
Okay, I don't want to be facetious here, but yeah, all right. I'm
right, and I'm
off there, because the coloring sheets are really not that important.
Right, and I mean, even if it's fucking kindergarten, they can miss school. But whatever. So I'm like, okay, if you can't make it, you can't make it. I don't need your explanation for whatever's happened. You don't have to justify it to me. If you can't make it, you can't make it. We all have our priorities and our things.
If you can't make it, just say that you can't. Don't make excuses.
Right. The next thing she says to me is, because the doctor had already come in, they're like, we've done all the surgery we can. We don't see this resolving on its own. He's going to die. They call in all the family, So that's why she's having this conversation with me. She says, so when he dies, can you set the funeral far enough out for me to come? I'm like, no, that's not how this works.
That's not.
You can either make it.
Funerals happen in 3 days.
Right. I'm like, you can either make it here or you can't. It's either a priority or it's not. It's not.
Yes.
It's not important enough to me to come while he's dying, but I want to show up for the funeral so that I can get sympathy from everybody and find out if I'm getting anything. That's not how this fucking works. I get that's how it works to a lot of Americans. That is not how it works for us. And I was done. And at that time, I was in the little hallway down what I call the bad news room. They always have that one little room set up at the end of the hallway of the intensive care units where they take people to give them the bad news.
Yes.
And that's where I was at, taking the phone call. And about that time, my parents walked by, and I just held the phone out to my mom, and I said, your daughter needs to talk to you, because I'm done. And yes. I really have only talked to her since then a couple of times. She called me because she needed to understand legal terminology to prepare a will when her husband was having a surgery. She texted me once to find out what size clothes my kids wore, because she was going to bring them something when she came down to visit. And she texted me after that, when she was coming to visit my parents, to tell me not to have me come see her. I didn't know she was coming. Okay, my mother told me, because I took my kids down there to drop them off for the summer, because they spend the summer down there.
Yes,
my mother told me
spend the summers in our communities.
Right.
So it's important. Everybody needs to get their kids back to their communities, even if you live in urban areas.
Right. So my mother tells me she's coming down there, and I'm like, and she's like, you know that, right? I'm like, why would I know that? We don't talk. So I guess she said something to her about it, because then I, like, out of nowhere get a text message that says, I'm going to be at Mom's in a few days. So if you want to buy some Avon from me, let me know, and I will bring it with me and leave it there for you to pick up later. So I'm like, I get it. I'm not invited. You don't want to see me. It's fine.
Now, do you think do you think she might have been making an excuse to see you, or do you think she was telling you not to because that's some coded language right there.
She very clearly said, I will bring it to leave there for you to pick up later. Mm-hmm. So it was not, I want to see you. And I mean, for that matter, they could have stopped here on the way down there if they wanted to. I mean,
yes, you don't live that far from I-35.
Right. So
when you heard from your sister about the Avon business that she has,
which and for the record, I have not bought Avon from her in about 3 or 4 years. So she had no reason to actually think I wanted to order some from her.
Yes. So what happened when you first read it? What happened? Tell us how you were feeling. What were the feelings in that moment?
I just kind of laughed out loud, and I'm like, I get it. I'm not invited. Okay, like I already knew that, but I'm like, okay, she clearly doesn't want to see me. I will make sure I don't come down there, and that was fine. Like I'm indifferent to it. I realized we have no relationship, which is why I knew I was going out on a limb by asking her if she was interested in doing the podcast. But I'm like, I'm going to put that out there. I know she's, and give her the chance to have a voice too, which she then turned around to, find a way to be mean to me and judgmental, which is fine, whatever.
Well, she pushed against a boundary that you established about something that you clearly, it was a hard no, you weren't going to discuss with her.
And then she also made a couple of jabs. Like she said, I'm also confused by the fact you think the environment was toxic, but you send your kids there for weeks at a time. And I'm like, hey, judgmental much, are we? But I'm like, yes. Of course, I don't know if she's aware of all the changes. Actually, yeah, I do, because we've had that conversation. There have been a lot of changes in reconciliation. So that, and she's aware of that. So that was just the judgmental jab. And I get it, whatever. Yes. Hurt people, but.
And that's important to recognize. Hurt people hurt people. Can you pinpoint what were the experiences in your childhood that harmed you the most?
Oh, the most? I don't know. I mean, I was an anxious kid because, like I said, there was always chaos in our house. It was always upheaval because, Dad's bad health and my mom was young, so she hadn't developed skills on how to deal with all that either necessarily, though she tried.
Yes.
And so, there were a lot of good intentions, but good intentions don't always yield good results.
Yes.
But I think the most traumatic experiences, I was molested by an older child when I was right before I went to kindergarten, so maybe 4.
Yes.
Which I guess that as far
that's
as having the longest, the most dramatic effect on my life, because when you think about the fact I was 4 years old, my very first orgasm came in the context of sexual abuse.
Yes.
So that was my first orgasm by manual stimulation. Do you know how many years it took me? It took me almost 3 decades to be okay with that, with allowing somebody to stimulate me that way again. To that point. And sometimes I still can't relax to do it. So, and then of course there was, there was a lot of fear of my dad. Even though he didn't really, he would whoop us with the belt or whatever, but there wasn't a whole lot of physical, like he hit me a couple of times, threw things at me, but it wasn't, of course in his mind that's not abusive because, he wasn't punching us in the face like he got. So,
yes.
But so there's always, but I can't handle being yelled at by men because I always feel like a physical violence is imminent. Even if it's not.
That's a good way to look at it.
Even if I know it's not a man that's going to do that, it's still like that's the immediate fight or flight. And then when I was 14, I ran away from home. And while I was gone, I was raped. And that's where PTSD comes from. And interestingly enough, that is the most traumatic experience of my life. But it actually caused a huge shift in my home life.
Okay.
Because I think they finally, now they will not to this day acknowledge that anything they did contributed to me running away ever. I was just being a selfish, horrible person, whatever. And I read that every time I hear somebody talk about they're just running away because their parents are imposing rules.
No, healthy people don't run away from healthy environments. That doesn't exist.
That's what I hear every time I hear that. I'm like, really, that's what you think? Not long after that, of course, Holly went off to college, and I think they just kind of realized, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. So, but they were afraid. Like, we haven't talked about the fact that I was raped. We've never actually openly acknowledged that. I do believe they are aware of it, but we don't have this conversation. And I hope we never will. I don't want to talk to them about it. Just because the way things transpired after I was found and taken to the cops and the hospital and everything. So they started there for a while just kind of ignoring the things. Like, I know damn well there is no way I was smoking
pot.
Up. Right.
Covering, this is...
that avoidance.
This would be akin to gaslighting someone, almost pretending that a terrible, highly traumatic situation didn't occur. When you refuse to acknowledge it, you are actually hindering somebody's ability to recover from it.
Part of it is they didn't know how to process or come to terms with it.
They weren't capable of it, because it genuinely was not meant to harm you. It was rather a side effect of their not knowing how to handle this. Exactly.
Right. And I asked for therapy when I was 15. I asked to be taken to therapy, and I was refused because they didn't trust that system, and they didn't believe that it would help. Plus, there's the whole preacher's kid thing. Mental health in the evangelical community, struggling with mental health is seen as a moral failing.
And I have heard of people in some, I have a hard time calling them churches, but in
they
some,
are.
There are entire groups of people that blame all of the medical problems, whether it is mental or physical, upon those who are suffering from them.
My grandmother, they believe it's all, if you're right with God, that won't happen. And if something's wrong with you, it means you're not right with God and you're doing something wrong.
See, I think that's criminal. I really do. I think that's criminal. That's criminal abuse of children and vulnerable people. So can you tell me from your childhood, what are the things that gave you strength? So take a look back, and I know you've talked about your extended family, because there are a lot of challenging situations. I can imagine, because I know all too well what it looks like when there's a health crisis in the family. What are some of the things that gave you strength that you carry with you from your childhood?
Oh no. I guess family a lot, we had family support. Our family, I like to joke about our family being one big dysfunctional family, and it's extended family too. It's not just, when I say family, a lot of people think I'm talking about just our nuclear family.
You're talking about the nuclear family.
But
we're
not,
how our families work.
Right. We've got the grandparents, and we've got the aunties, and we've got this extended network.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being 3 years old, spending, I know it was at least 2 weeks, probably longer, with one of my aunties. I vividly remember, because God, they had so many kids. Because my uncle had like 8 kids, and then they all had a bunch of kids.
1 or 2 more didn't really matter.
Right. And everybody, we all spend a lot of time during the summer with the grandparents, right? So there was like a herd of kids there.
Absolutely.
Because that was the grandmother's house too.
Yes.
And so there was like tons
that was
of kids.
Their home, yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And of course it's hilarious because there's only like 4 of us that are mixed, right? So we're like the little light skin cousins. So it's hilarious. So of course, they like to tease us about being white, which is always funny. Which is hilarious now because a lot of their grandkids look like me.
Anecdotally, I love how you said my grandmother's house, and that is something unique to Indigenous people. We don't call the homes as belonging to the father or the grandfather.
Yeah, I forget that people do that.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that we were raised with differently than happens in a lot of evangelical churches is we were raised to never depend on a man or a partner. And a lot of that was because, well, for one, my grandmother, I love my grandfather. I love him. I'm his favorite grandchild and then, of course, my kids came along and they outrank me now. But
yes, of course.
Especially one of them. He is not shy about having a favorite. But he was an abusive alcoholic, and
Yes.
she stayed with him, and she continually go back to him, and she always said, and I guess in my dad's mind it was always, well, she financially needs him, which was not the reality, but that was how it was set up in his mind. And so that's what he always told us. He's like, you need to be able to support your family. Of course, in our culture, that's our job anyways, to be able to support our own children.
Yes.
But between I don't want you to ever feel like you're stuck in an abusive relationship, and what if your significant other died? Because like I said, he was always dying. One of my aunties married a wonderful man, and he died like 6 months later, and they were still really young. And so, we were always raised with that drilled into us. You need to support yourself. You need to go do these things.
You able to support yourself.
Right,
yep,
because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, yeah, that's one thing that I think has sustained me and made me part of who I am, is that, growing up with that, I don't know, instruction. I don't want to call it a value. I don't think it's a value. I think it's just common sense that, you need to be able to support yourself, and also we were raised on a small ranch. We learned how to work. And so we knew how to.
That work ethic.
Right. To work hard, and it doesn't always have to be, nice or glamorous or fun, but, find a way, figure out what you want and find a way to get there. So that's just what I do. And of course, our cultural values and teachings are very important. I try to let them guide everything that I do. And when I don't, it usually ends up bad, and I have to fix it.
Yeah. So that's kind of that's definitely a bright thread that goes throughout your childhood, and even into the sense of community responsibility that you practice, and that is very much a part of your life today. So can you tell me a little bit about what community interdependence, especially within tribal community structures, what that looks like to you?
What do you mean?
So,
can you elaborate,
one of the
please?
key differences between different cultures, and I see it all the time in our young people coming up, they will look at needs within the community, and they will base their life careers. You've done it yourself, with your background. You haven't discussed exactly what your diplomas are related to. However, you went into those fields after you saw that there was a need for them. So what does healthy interdependence look like?
Healthy interdependence. I'm not sure we're always healthy, but I think support networks and
positive interdependence,
right? And having that, having a support system in. I think we want it to look like, some particular way, but, the reality is we're people, and we are from communities with intergenerational trauma, so they're not always going to look pristine and perfect. I have family who's in prison or has been in prison, or, who've done horrible things, but that doesn't mean they're horrible people, and that doesn't mean I throw them away either. And I have aunties who call me when,
Have you gotten a call about broken yet?
I have not, and
we're gonna have to talk about it when you do, because I know it's coming.
I have deliberately not invited any of the aunties to the page or shared it on my private profile, because I don't want that call.
I haven't either. I don't want to be called out for some of the stuff we talk about.
Well, I'm not worried about being called out for some of the stuff we talk about, because I am the exact same person I am on the podcast as I am in real life. I have no problem talking to my aunties about this stuff. I have no problem talking about it in front of them. I mean, sometimes you might get a little tisk, but whatever. I'm like, you guys raised me. Like, I've heard you talk this shit before. Just because you're super churchy now, like, I remember you 20 years ago. You taught me this stuff. So, I don't want to get the call when I accidentally say something about one of them and they recognize themselves in the story and they're not happy about it. That's the call I don't want to get. Because the only thing I'm going to be able to say is, but where's the lie?
See, I can very well picture, the older women in my family chewing me out over our use of language. I still get the fuck is a terrible, horrible word to use, and it's extremely limiting. So, this is my experience. So, but I will say the women in my family, I know they would support me and the work that, we're working on and the work that we want to do. You can contact the podcast at brokebrokenpodcast@gmail.com. The Broken Podcast can be found on Twitter at Broke Broken Show, on Instagram and Facebook at Broke Broken Podcast.